Welcome back. Last week, the U.S. House of Representatives narrowly passed the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. It is a 1,000-page piece of legislation that includes, among many other things, some severe tax implications for Canadian companies and Canadian individuals. Let's talk about it with our next expert guest. He's Kim Moody, founder of Moody's Tax Law and Moody's Private Client Services in Calgary. Kim, thanks a lot for joining us. You make the point in an op-ed piece, which I gather is going to be published tomorrow, that there's a lot in the legislation. One part of it that you're concerned about is U.S. moves aimed as retaliation to what U.S. lawmakers see as unfair taxes imposed by other governments on U.S. companies. And in particular, you point to the Canadian digital services tax as an example. Why don't you continue?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. And yes, you've described that accurately. There's actually two things generally that the United States is concerned about. It's countries that have imposed what they refer to as unfair tax practices or taxes against American companies, like the digital services tax. But the other one that's in their crosshairs is the global minimum tax top-ups, which was spearheaded by the OECD and implemented by a number of countries like Canada. So presently we have the digital services tax and the global minimum tax top-ups in Canadian law, and that is squarely the reason why this piece of legislation, Section 899 of this big, beautiful bill, is trying to take aim at, and it could be fairly devastating if it ever gets passed.
How so? What might be an example of a devastating, to use your word, a devastating consequence?
Well, just very simply, if you have let's say a retail investor that invests in U.S. stocks, for example, that pays dividends, or a U.S. bond that pays interest. Right now we have tax treaties in place to limit the amount of withholding tax that the U.S. can impose. And depending on who owns that, if it's an individual, that generally on dividends, it's going to be 15%. Well, now that withholding rate could be as high as 30%, and in some cases higher. And so the issue is whether or not Canada will grant foreign tax credits for that extra tax. And under current law, it's pretty debatable. I would suggest the answer is probably no. And so it could result in some permanent tax leakage. So that's a retail investor. It could
I just want to pause there, because the people who are watching this are in large measure retail investors, and many of them own shares of publicly traded U.S. companies, and many of those would receive dividends from those companies. So you're saying what? That effectively that flow of dividends from U.S. corporations is going to become less profitable for the Canadian investors who receive them, because the Canadian investors, will have to pay more tax on those dividends, correct?
Correct. If Canada is labeled what I refer to as a bad country, then yes, there could be some permanent tax leakage if Canada doesn't grant relief on that, which under existing law, it doesn't look like it would.
Okay. What about Canadian companies that might be operating in the United States?
Very similar result. If you have a Canadian company that has U.S. operations through let's say a U.S. subsidiary, any dividends that would normally be returned to Canada, like the Canadian parent company, in most cases by way of treaty of 5% withholding rate, could be as high as 30% as well, and which again would be devastating. And the other issue is if they're not operating through a subsidiary, but let's say they're just operating directly out of their Canadian company. Well, there's what's referred to as a branch tax, which tries to mimic the otherwise dividend if it was operated through a company. That would be at a much, much higher rate as well, which would be devastating as well. The other issue is whether or not tax-exempt pension funds would be subject to this new rule, and it looks like they would be, like the Canada Pension Plan, who holds great amount of investments in the U.S., as I understand it. Those could now be subject to tax on any U.S. source earnings, whereas right now by treaty they're exempt, and so that would be pretty devastating.
Okay, so the implications are, the potential implications are profound. How do you think Canada should be responding here? And we all understand, of course, that Canada's got its hands full right now to responding in a number of ways to new U.S. policies.
Well, I wrote about this back when Donald Trump got elected in November. I said that Canada really has to take a hard look at how competitive from a tax perspective they are currently and what's to come. And frankly, now, what's to come is coming to fruition, and there's probably going to be more. And so what should Canada do? Well, ideally, we drop the digital services tax and the global minimum top-ups, but that's easier said than done politically for a variety of reasons. At the minimum, what needs to happen is certainly some negotiations to make sure that Canada does not get labeled as a so-called bad country. That would be a minimum.
What should let's circle back to for our final question to retail
Sure.
investors. What should they be doing? They should be following this story closely. Obviously, they should follow what happens to the so-called big beautiful bill in Congress. It's now in the Senate, and changes are certainly possible. So they should be paying close attention. What should they be doing if these changes become U.S. law?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head here. At a minimum, you need to follow it, and certainly it's going to be in for a ride, perhaps a rough ride in the Senate. So, but if it does get passed, should retail investors continue to invest in the U.S.? Well, that's going to, because that would be the way around it, is to not invest in the U.S. And avoid these extra, withholding taxes. But from an investment perspective, that may make zero sense, given the vast. The United States is a gorilla when it comes to investment options. So I think their bottom line is I think they're going to have to really watch this bill quite carefully to see what actions they need to take in the future.
Kim, thank you very much for a great conversation. Kim Moody is founder of Moody's Tax Law and Moody's private client practice in Calgary. Coming up,